Okay, so let's get started. My best colleague, friend, and co-convener, Jesus Velasco, has succumbed to a bug that is going around and has touched others as well. I know Jeremy Kessler is with us virtually also, and others. So there's something going around. So I'll try and step in for Jesus, and we'll start the seminar. So while the previous year's lectures on the punitive society focused in part on the birth of the penitentiary and were motivated by the question, why the prison 150 years ago and for 150 years, Foucault turns in November 1973 to the birth of the asylum in a radically anti-institutionalist way. His objects are the psychiatric practices in the early period, what he calls proto-psychiatry, from 1790 to about 1820, 1830. Just as he had added the term practice to the title of his second series, which was Penal Theories and Institutions, in his very first breath of those lectures, here too he's going to be focusing on practices, maneuvers, strategies, tactics, the tactics of the psychiatrists. From the outset, Foucault corrects his past mistakes. He was wrong in his History of Madness, he tells us, to focus on representations and images, discourses of truth, or to focus first on institutions. Before we begin to think about institutions, the family, the asylum, the state, before we even begin to think about discourses of truth, we need to understand what he calls the microphysics of power, electrifying the relationship between the doctor and the patient. He was wrong to focus on violence. He was wrong to place the family model at the heart of the asylum, he tells us. Instead, we need to look at these strategies. And his approach, he says, is going to be radically anti-institutionalist. On page 33, he says, let's be really anti-institutionalist. What I propose to bring to light this year is, before analysis of the institution, the microphysics of power. And in this vein, as Jesus Velasco points out was going to point out in his comments, and we will post those comments because they were so exceptional, Foucault immediately turns away from the expressions he had been contesting for 2 years, the notion of apparatuses, right, and deploys a new term, dispositif, right? We see that term on page 13 being born. Now, in Psychiatric Power, Foucault elaborates on his theory of power, which he had just begun to set out so precisely in the last lecture of the Punitive Society on March 28, 73. Here, on November 7th, 73, he picks up on the thread. Power is not something that is possessed. It's struggle, war, tactics, strategies. The war model is there. The idea of civil war, which was so present the year before, is here, although the word itself is not there. But the battles, the battlefields, the struggles all recur and will, of course, lead to the book from 75. If we could think of the 1972 lectures with François Ewald as a prototype for a repressive model of power, and if we could think of the 1973 lectures as a prototype for a productive, punitive model of power, then perhaps we can think of these 1974 lectures as the prototype for the disciplinary model of power. Psychiatric power is struggle, mastery, and direction of others. As Foucault writes, page 174, I direct, I praise, I reward, reprimand, command, constrain, threaten, and punish every day. The words of the psychiatrist. Now, in these lectures, Foucault is going to revisit and refine themes from the year before, from 73. The relationship to Marx, so on page 71, again, we get this notion of supplementing a theory of capital accumulation with a theory of the accumulation of men. His theory of the panopticon comes back, pages 73 to 80. Use of timetables, this time for the children at Bicêtre. The discussion of colonialism and slavery on page 69. He returns to the critique of Durkheim and to the notion of individuality in his discussions on page 57. He gives us a little history of truth, as Daniele Lorenzini wrote about on the wrote a beautiful little article on the blog Foucault 1313. He foreshadows a lot of things, his interest in dangerousness, in monomania, and in social defense, which he will develop in his 78 lectures on the notion of dangerous individuals in 19th century psychiatry, as well as in the last lecture of wrongdoing truth-telling. He'll foreshadow his interest in avowal in these lectures, and will develop a fascinating theory of the family, which we will be discussing. And of course, he sets the stage for a few things. One of them is the next year, or in 3 weeks, abnormal. So you see this very clearly when he starts writing about abnormality and normality in abnormal children, particularly around pages 190, 202, 221, drawing on Canguilhem's work. And of course, he sets up his work on the history of sexuality. These 1974 lectures are where sexuality begins to take shape as an object of study. Of course, Foucault has talked about sexuality before. In L'Ordre du Discours, in his inaugural lectures at the Collège de France, he had rehearsed how his archaeological approach would play out on sexuality. In The Punitive Society, the year before, he had explored the disciplinary regulation of the sexuality of workers. He had looked at the sexuality at school. But here, in 1974, the object begins to gel as he explores how the medical knowledge of hysteria tried to hide sexuality, but how, as psychiatry moved from the asylum to the hospital, as it became not just madness, but illness, it became possible to see emerge the medicalization of sexuality. And of course, you know the last sentences, the last words from this lecture series, which I'll read, and you can turn to in the English, but I'll read it in French. En forçant les portes de l'asile, en cessant d'être des folles pour devenir des malades, en entrant enfin chez un vrai médecin, c'est-à-dire chez le neurologue, en lui fournissant des vrais symptômes fonctionnels, les hystériques, pour leur plus grand plaisir, mais sans doute pour notre plus grand malheur, ont donné prise à la médecine sur la sexualité. Of course, that's how he closes these lectures. Now, it's there, I think, that we will begin with the topic of hysteria and relationship to sexuality and power, disciplinary power. And that's how we're going to begin our conversation today in this seminar. We are blessed to have 3 extraordinary thinkers with us who are going to enlighten and lead the discussion. Linda Zarelli is a leading critical thinker and the Charles E. Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science in the College at the University of Chicago. She's also the director of the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Her new forthcoming book, A Democratic Theory of Judgment, will be coming out with the University of Chicago Press in a few months, part of which she presented in a seminar in political theory last week with Nadia Urbinati. She also hosted last week an extraordinary seminar with the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought called The Idea of a Critical Political Theory, which was great, and thank you for that. Alondra Nelson is our Dean of Social Science at Columbia University and Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies, and she previously served as Director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality here at Columbia. Her forthcoming book, also, The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, which should be out January 12th, and we will all read it immediately, traces how claims about ancestry are marshaled together with genetic analysis in a range of social ventures. Dean Nelson is a leading interdisciplinary scholar working on the issue of the social implications of scientific research and applications from perspectives that include ethnicity, race, and gender. And Anna Lvovsky is a historian and a legal scholar, works on gender and sexuality with a focus on the history of homosexuality. And she works on these issues from a cross-disciplinary perspective involving state regulations, morality, and the social sciences. She's currently a colleague and academic fellow at Columbia Law School. Her dissertation, Queer Expertise, Urban Policing and the Construction of Public Knowledge about Homosexuality, 1920 to 1970, touches on many of the issues that are central to today's lectures. So we are delighted to have you all here. And Linda, you're going to start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for inviting me and taking on this absolutely phenomenal project, which, as I've said to you, is creating a really valuable archive for anyone who wants to study Foucault generally, but certainly these lectures. So this is amazing what you're doing here. Okay, quote, "We salute the hysterics as the true militants of anti-psychiatry," declares Foucault at the end of his January 23rd lecture on psychiatric power. What exactly does Foucault, genealogist of power, find in, or better, what does he want from, the hysterics, those famous dear hysterics? How can a psychiatric patient, most likely female and working class, and therefore most vulnerable to the invasive and often reckless forms of medical treatment that took place in the at once hidden and open spaces of the large European public hospitals and asylums of the 19th century, figure what Foucault calls the militant underside of psychiatric power? How can her actions, restricted for the most part to the mute or nonsensical exhibition of the whole repertoire of hysterical symptoms, trembling and shaking, convulsion and paralysis, uncontrolled sobbing and laughing, count as meaningful resistance? How can this otherwise voiceless feminized object in the androcentric theatrical spaces of psychiatric authority, lorded over by men like Jean-Martin Charcot, who call the Salpêtrière a, quote, living pathological museum that contained a considerable amount of material, how can this person possibly figure the very gravedigger of such authority and indeed psychiatry as a knowledge-power relation? Let me put my cards on the table. If I had my choice, I would not choose the hysteric to figure resistance to power, let alone proto-feminism. But of course, it's not feminism as such that the hysteric figures for Foucault either. It is something more like a blind spot in a certain technology of power, namely disciplinary power, that the hysteric makes visible, and in so doing, exposes its necessary, if denied, condition, the subject's freedom or capacity to act otherwise, or so I will argue. Whether this exposure amounts to the militant resistance that Foucault claims for it is another question. The 1973-74 lectures that make up psychiatric power narrate the birth of psychiatry as part of a larger story about the emergence of disciplinary power and its difference from the power of sovereignty. The 14th of November lecture, which lays out what Foucault calls the great founding scene of modern psychiatry, dramatizes the difference between these two forms of power. And it is dramatized through the famous scene in which Philippe Pinel removes the chains binding the raving lunatics who express their gratitude and become available for being cured. It is, however, not so much this scene, but another to which Foucault calls our attention, in which mad George III of England is told, quote, that he is no longer sovereign, but that he must henceforth be obedient and submissive, unquote, not to another king, but to a form of power that, quote, differs term by term from the power of sovereignty, is anonymous, nameless, and faceless, a power that is expressed only through an implacable regulation, and whose presence is only found in the obedience and submission of those on whom it is silently exercised. Now, the most vivid expression of this power is Bentham's Panopticon, with this de-individualization and disembodiment of power and the, quote, endless extraction of knowledge from the individual on whom such power is pinned, I'm quoting, pinned in a given space and followed by a potentially continuous gaze, unquote. In this sense, writes Foucault, panopticism could appear and function within our society as a general form. We could speak equally of a disciplinary society or a panoptic society. We live within generalized panopticism by virtue of the fact that we live within a disciplinary society. But if panopticism captures the essence of disciplinary power, it does so at the risk of blinding us to what such power takes for granted, but does not think through: freedom or the subject's capacity to act otherwise. This capacity would be at the heart of what the later Foucault defines as relations of governance, where to be governed involves, quote, an encounter between technologies of domination of others and those of the self, unquote. Whereas the former, quote, determines the contact of individuals, The latter permit individuals to effect by their own means, or with the help of others, certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, unquote. It is not that Foucault discovers the freedom of the subject only later, when he embarks on an analysis of governmentality, as his critics accuse. It is rather that, like the technology of domination called disciplinary power, the author of these lectures did not really think through the freedom of the subject to act otherwise, that the later Foucault would see as what such power actually took for granted, but also as potentially leading to the undoing of such power itself. Thus, when Foucault, in the 1980 Sexuality and Solitude, observes, "When I was studying asylums, prisons, and so on, I perhaps insisted too much on the techniques of domination," he is not conceding the denial of freedom that his critics claim to find in the earlier writings. He is noting that he, the earlier Foucault, had not clearly thought through the ways in which freedom shaped the workings of disciplinary power. But there is in fact a place in Foucault's 1973 and 74 texts where such freedom, or capacity to act otherwise, if not exactly thought through, surfaces as something other than the kind of resistance that Foucault had associated with power knowledge regimes like the asylum and the prison. This resistance comes not in the form of countervailing regimes of power that make different demands on the subject and so open the space for resistance. The triumph over power is exercised not by a subject caught between competing demands of power, nor is it exercised by the metaphorical prisoner isolated in his cell. Rather, the, quote, victory cry over psychiatric power comes in the form of the mostly female psychiatric patient in the theatrical space and throes of hysterical simulation. It is hysterical simulation, not panopticism, that captures the features of disciplinary power that go beyond its impersonal quality to its tactical character, quote, the network's currents, relays, points of support, differences of potential, and so on, that figure such power as a game in which the possibility for resistance is realized. To understand the radical resistance that goes under the name of hysterical simulation for Foucault, we have to grasp what the hysteric is being asked to confirm. Namely, the authority of the doctor, understood as impersonal and anonymous, and the legitimacy of psychiatric power, its capacity to accurately diagnose and cure mental illness. Above all, this confirmation involves a subject in manifesting her subjectivity, that is, enacting that which she is taken to be. In this sense, the hysteric must be willing to play the game. At the same time, however, it is just her will that, like that of the Mad King George III, the game of psychiatric power is supposed to subordinate, and such subordination is crucial to the demonstration of psychiatric power in the authoritative figure of the doctor. By producing symptoms that conform to hysteria as an illness, but are simulated, the hysteric poses a challenge to the authority of the doctor that the manifestation of hysterical symptoms is supposed to secure. It is an authority premised on never posing the question of truth, premised on the claim that psychiatry, as a true science, already contains all the criteria of truth, and so closes every outside space for its adjudication. To this the hysteric says, writes Foucault, if you claim to possess the truth once and for all, in terms of an already fully constituted knowledge, well, for my part, I will install falsehood in myself, unquote. I will in effect avow that which you say I am, a hysteric, but you will never know whether such avowal is true. For this reason, disciplinary power has to eliminate the possibility of simulation. And so Charcot and his pupils would develop and employ a range of self-registering instruments to facilitate control over the will of their experimental subjects. The devices were meant to create an objective index for the existence of a hypnotic state that would eliminate the suspicion that a hypnotized subject was simulating. Crucial here is that psychiatric power cannot settle simply for eliminating the role of the subject's will. It needs the subject to freely avow its obedience and submission, to will not to will, so to speak. And though this is not really thematized in the early 1970s lectures that make up psychiatric power, my argument is that the importance of avowal, as it links up with freedom as the very condition of power, is prefigured in Foucault's account of the hysteric, even if it is not properly thought through. To get at the difference in his understanding of the place of freedom in power relations, consider the story of Dr. Leray, known for using brutally cold showers to extract the truth of madness from his patients. In his December 19th lecture of 1973, Foucault explains this mostly in terms of the need to establish what he calls an imbalance of power and a state of docility that will make the patient available for psychiatric treatment. In the 1981 inaugural Louvain lecture that was published in Wrongdoing Truth-Telling, however, Foucault describes the same cold shower treatment in different terms. Now the emphasis is less on creating docile bodies than it is on extracting the patient's avowal of madness. On the one hand, the patient is physically constrained to avow. That is the role played by the cold shower. Though not in the chains that bound mad patients in psychiatric power's prehistory, the patient cannot meaningfully be said to make a free choice. Yet Leray was assuming that he did. As Foucault asks in 1981, but not in 1973, these lectures, quote, "Why must an avowal, even when it is obtained through force, be considered free in order to take on its effects?" As Daniel Nichanian astutely parses this scene, quote, "This puzzle could be rephrased as follows. Why does Leray ask a question at all? The answer is that the economy of this relationship is sustained by the assumption that the patient is manifesting his own subjectivity, that he is avowing freely." Unquote. The question is not whether such freedom is a mere ruse, but why presupposing it is absolutely crucial to how power works, according to the later Foucault, but also to power's potential undoing. Returning to the hysteric, we might say that at issue is not just the manifestation of the truth of herself in a game she is invited to play, and so participation in her own subjection. Though this was a crucial aspect of Foucault's account at the time of how power works, through subjectivation, it is not the whole of how power works for him, not even in the period prior to his writings on governmentality, with its emphasis on freedom as the very condition of any relation of power. For the later Foucault, treating the other as free is not a mark that one has exited the domain of strategic relations, observes Nichanian. The question, however, is whether a particular technology of government and of power thinks this freedom through or not. Technologies that do not think it through but presuppose it incite subjects to act in games whose outcomes may destabilize rather than secure the ends of that incitation. That, in a nutshell, is the subversive power of hysterical simulation. The question for us now, however, is whether the capacity to act otherwise is captured in Foucault's account of hysterical simulation. The issue, it seems to me, concerns the question of whether subversive actions are here being restricted to certain gains that seem to foreclose ways of acting otherwise that are not already given in the scripts and the intersubjective relations of the gains themselves. To get at this problem, we need to see that hysterical simulation is not just an example of a rebellious act in which a subject refuses to play by the rules of the game. Such refusal can be taken as to play by the rules of the game, can be taken as a sign that one is not properly manifesting one's subjectivity. This is especially the case when the improper subject is a woman, the rebellious actions of a wife, who is not manifesting her feminine subjectivity properly can be assimilated into, rather than challenge, the regime of power. Her actions can be traced back to her husband's mismanagement of her. It is he, not she, who is free to act differently. For Foucault, hysterical simulation amounts to much more than breaking the rules of the game. It is fundamentally corrosive of the game of psychiatric power itself. Corrosive because it is a response that is not external but internal to the game itself, a response that is given in the very logic of the game itself. And though this insight about how taking seriously the rules of the game of power could undermine it would not be clearly articulated until later, when Foucault develops his idea of government, it is implicit in his claim that hysterical simulation undid psychiatric power. Indeed, this is the only way I can make sense of that incredible assertion, whether or not I agree with it. I say incredible because the drive to root out simulation as a serious threat to medical authority gave rise not to a weakened game, let alone to the recognition of the hysteric's freedom, but as mentioned earlier, to increasingly complex and elaborate systems of verification designed to root out the possibility of deception. In response to critics who claimed that Salpêtrière hysterics were the, quote, absolute worst subjects in the world on whom to base scientific conclusions, Charcot defined the key task of the, quote, truly informed physician as tracking down deception everywhere it appears and separating from the real symptoms, which are a fundamental part of the illness, the simulated symptoms that the artifice of the patient would like to add to them, unquote. And surely these techniques of power were known to Foucault. I mean, this ever more vigilant form of surveillance. In Foucault's account, however, the hysteric simulation owes its destabilizing effects to the demonstration that she is taking the system's rules very seriously in the act of provoking it. Quote, Foucault, the hysteric constitutes herself as the blazon of genuine illness. She models herself as a body and sight bearing genuine symptoms, unquote. But though this demonstration, well within the rules of the game, ought to underwrite the doctor's power knowledge, his sole authority, quote, to arbitrate on the question of the reality or non-reality of madness, unquote, it actually undermines that authority, quote, responding with the most precise and well-determined symptoms. And while doing this, she pursues a game that wants to fix her illness in reality. One can never manage to do so, since when her symptom should refer to an organic substratum, she shows that there is no substratum, so that she cannot be fixed at the level of the reality of her illness at the very moment she displays the most spectacular symptoms, unquote. There is no substratum, we might say, because there is only symptom. The symptom is the reality created by hysterical simulation. The symptom is the sole reality that undoes the reality of the physiological substratum, the demonstration of whose existence was intended to confirm psychiatric power. This inversion operates by means not of refusing to play the game of hysteria, but by playing it all too well, by taking its indications and signs all too seriously. Thus, in strictly conforming to the game's rules, hysterical simulation undoes them. The doctor is failing to acknowledge what he is asking the hysteric to do, to freely manifest her illness. The possibility of doing this takes for granted, of course, that she is free to act otherwise. We do well to recall that, on the one hand, as a technology of governance that does not think through freedom, psychiatric power finds itself in the case of hysterical simulation in the throes of performative contradictions. It needs the subject to freely avow itself as ill, while also denying that such freedom is possible because she is ill. On the one hand, I'm not convinced that an account of freedom that operates in what Nikanian describes as an ontological register of relations of reciprocity is the best way to understand resistance. By locating resistance in the intersubjective entanglements that Foucault will later describe as relations of government, premised on the subject's freedom, we risk overlooking the extent to which resistance involves playing different games, engaging in different practices other than those in which one is already incited to act or manifest one's subjectivity in certain ways, even if that is accompanied with the recognition that one is free. Both the subject's refusal or inadequate execution of the need for avowal and a hyper form of avowal, like hysterical simulation, may produce what Foucault calls blockages and derailments for a technology of power. But it is not clear as to how it would transform power. For that, I think we need to look at how subjects break with the knowledge power games in which their freedom is both presupposed and denied by founding new ones. It would be the difference, to conclude, between the women who may well have developed hysterical symptoms out of protest against their confinement in the 19th century patriarchal family, but who remained for the most part caught up in the technologies of power that included the psychiatric hospital and its patriarchal structure on the one hand, and the women who expressed their form of protest through the development of new forms of association, including the forms that made up the first wave of feminism. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Bernard, for having me, for staging this year-long intellectual happening, and for inviting me to participate. And it's a real honor to meet Linda and Anna. It was great to sit and read this work. I mean, you know, for those of us of a certain generation, reading Foucault is like a warm blanket, right? There's a soothing, familiar voice that's kind of foundational to a lot of what we do and think. And I'm going to sort of I try to read it a bit against the grain of another book of mine, which is called Body and Soul, and is about the Black Panthers' health activism, and is about their engagement from 66 forward with psychiatry and anti-psychiatry as it affects Black communities. And so that's kind of where I get to where I'm going. But I began with just a slight meditation on the hysteric, which I found just, this is like for me the insight, one of the big takeaways of this, because I think that in his attempt to offer his own genealogy that Bernard sort of laid out from madness as discourse and representation to psychiatric power, we see sexuality here at the very core in this narrative of Foucault's evolution of his thought, but I kind of want to forestall and question his own evolution, and for us to think about rather how far he's really moved on from, say, the punitive society. And I want to think about what does it mean to place the hysterical woman and her unruly sexuality that becomes abstracted by the time we get to the Histories of Sexuality, Volume 1 and 2, at the center of Foucault's project, his later work. I didn't recall a mention in either Volume 1 or 2 of the hysteric, and so I actually did a digital search, and it's mentioned twice in Volume 1 and not at all in Volume 2. And the hysteric in Volume 1 is mentioned as a male, so he's hysteric, them, he, and so it's kind of fascinating. So I wanted to sort of think about and put on the table, although my comments will build on a couple other points, the sort of encasement and abstraction of the hysteric as part of Foucault's work, and what does it mean for the history of sexuality, given the feminist critique of hysteria that Linda sort of gestures to. And more fundamentally, is the history of sexuality, which is so important for women and gender and sexuality studies, inherently an anti-feminist text. And I just want to let that sit there and kind of think about that, because this hysteric moment in these lectures is absolutely fascinating. So I think that the lectures also offer some insight into what we might call the compound or the secondary encasement, or in Foucault's word, redoubling of medical power in response to the hysteric, right? So to contain the hysteric and her sexuality. He talks about on page 323 and 324. But I also was left wanting to talk more about power and social difference in Foucault, especially with regards to race and empire, and I want to spend the rest of my time talking about that. So this compound encasement, or this redoubling that happens with the hysteric vis-a-vis psychiatric illness, I want to suggest. produces a bifurcation of power and thinking about power in Foucault's work. And so this is where I want to suggest that he's not sort of moving forward in the teleology that he suggests, but is actually thinking about a different kind of power and leaving behind ways of thinking about a kind of brute force of power. That's the power that's left with the middle class, working class hysterical women, and of course people who are living in the colonies. So the new power that Foucault is putting forward, which would become part of his new preoccupation, I think, is a bifurcation from a kind of old power, the penitentiary power that remains in place for perhaps the non-hysteric, for the non-bourgeoisie, and for the colony as opposed to the metropole, as I suggested. So in the first lecture of Psychiatric Power, 7 November 1973, as I said, he tells us that he's moving away from genealogy, from the family, from state apparatus, towards an apparatus of power, the dispositif of power. And he offers later that he speaks of new justifications that are needed for a doctor's power after Pasteur, which is on 341 and 342, a moment where the doctors can be seen to cause harm as well as healing. But no such justifications are arguably required in a colonial context. And I'm thinking here of Frantz Fanon, who I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, who writes in The Wretched of the Earth from 1961 in a chapter that's entitled Colonial War and Mental Disorders. And I want to sort of layer or think side by side Fanon's invocation of war in 61 with Foucault's turn to battles and war in a different context in the early 70s, even as I want to suggest that there's a bifurcation of old and new power, kind of a brute power and we might call a soft power, with obvious quotes around that. So here that we see there's a turn to a new apparatus of power that Foucault maps, but doesn't necessarily include a space that's extraterritorial to the metropole. In scenes described by Fanon, the redoubling of power, the second encasement of power into a structure of knowledge, is in fact forestalled by the brute power of empire and its aims. So Fanon offers for us in The Wretched of the Earth a kind of trenchant dissection of racialized medical oppression in colonial Algeria. Fanon, will remember, was trained as a physician in Lyon, and he practiced psychiatry in the Antilles. And then in 1953, he would become an employee of the French government and was assigned to lead the psychiatry department in a colonial hospital in Algeria. And it was while that he was working there that the Algerian War for Independence in France began, and his experiences treating Algerian nationals traumatized by colonial oppression, as well as his observations of the devastating psychological effects of war, compelled him to resign his post and begin working on the side of Algerian liberation. And as the medical sociologist Jacques McCulloch offers for us, we might think of The Wretched of the Earth as offering, among other things, as a kind of sociology of mental illness, as well as a critique of ethnopsychiatry. And the ethnopsychiatry, in this case, might be the very genealogy of psychiatric power that Foucault is outlining for us, even as he says he's moving to a non-genealogical way of thinking about his work. So to use Fanon's sarcastic formulation, the, quote, hesitation of the colonizer in giving responsibility to the native is not racism nor paternalism, but quite simply a scientific appreciation of the biologically limited possibilities of the native, close quote. During times of war, a kind of insidious form of ethnopsychiatry emerges. Doctors were explicit, as he called them, agents of colonialism, who administered torture disguised as medicine, which Fanon called subversive war. The medical warfare described by Fanon included administering medication to induce confessions from Algerian prisoners and deploying categories of medical pathology to mark the colonial subject. In this chapter, Colonial Medicine, in this final chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's critique of colonial medicine and the effects of colonial war in Algeria take the form of medical case histories. And he offers that these studies as proof of the ravages of colonialism and as confirmation of the abuses of politicized colonial medicine. And by way of introduction to these case studies, he writes, quote, clinical psychiatry classifies the different disturbances shown by our patients under the heading reactionary psychoses. In doing this, prominence is given to the event which has given rise to the disorder, which are chiefly the bloodthirsty and pitiless atmosphere and the generalization of inhuman practices, close quote. And then the chapter quickly moves to Fanon's recounting of his specific experiences in the Algerian War and dealing with French and Algerian patients during wartime. And in each account, Fanon describes the patient's symptoms and then the diagnoses of the condition as deriving from extramedical or social rather than biological origins, which is, in Foucault here, is the anti-psychiatry move. So the hysteric provides via herself the ways to know her, as Linda really excellently delineated for us. And Foucault suggests this is through a new scientific lens. Fanon, by contrast, I think, offers for us the colonial other, man or woman, as a figure that's ultimately unknowable through any mechanism save domination and dehumanization. The doctor's powers are called into question at the turn of the 19th century, but at the same time, the doctor retains power, and thinking about the Pasteur move, not of necessarily of knowledge-making and testing, but of surveilling and policing over other populations of patients, and in this case, colonial subjects, or we might think about immigrants in France in this period. Before the anti-psychiatry movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s, there is to use Foucault's word, the redoubling of the doctor's role as police authority and this bifurcated power space of empire that I'm trying to talk about here. So that there are two social gestures simultaneously. The refinement of the work of the hospital, on the one hand, through the negation of the hysteric, and the mission creep of the hospital combined with its carceral aims, right, as an extension of the penitentiary rather than a sort of move away from it. Fanon stages an alternative perspective from what Foucault calls de-psychiatricization, which for Foucault was either a hyperscientism or with a healing mandate or a deep dive into madness as responses. And Fanon, again, also identifies scientific diagnoses, as I've described, but then switching to anti-psychiatry questions, right, about the power and the politics that provide a context for psychiatry. He places the very definition of madness into question, and therefore making psychiatry as a healing site, both suspect and unnecessary. So I wanted to point out that in the sections on anti-psychiatry, which are in the 300s, 310s, 320s, that Foucault cites the work of David Cooper and also of Thomas Szasz to talk about, these are important thinkers of anti-psychiatry. But, David Cooper also sort of notably cited Fanon, but didn't cite Fanon as a psychiatrist. He cites Fanon as a colonial theorist, including in this work Psychiatry and Anti-Psychiatry from 1967, but doesn't take seriously Fanon as a scientist, right, to go back to Fanon's own words about how colonial subjects are thought about. In their book, Colonial Perspectives on Mental Health, Victoria Coppock and John Hopton take Cooper to task for ignoring the influence of Fanon on his work. They write, quote, "One of the most striking examples of critical theorists of mental health failing to acknowledge the links between his work and that of a previous writer is Cooper's virtual disregard of the clinical psychiatry of Fanon. Cooper's ideas about mental health were explicitly socialist and existentialist, as were Fanon's. However, while Cooper publicly acknowledged the operations of Fanon's work and its import for his political philosophy, he made only passing reference to the connections between Fanon's politics and him as a clinical practitioner," close quote. And then they also note in a second section that Elaine Showalter criticizes Cooper and Lang in another project for the sexism of their work. So anti-psychiatry here is a kind of redirection of our attention to power relations, right, rather than brute power that surround and prefigure psychiatry, which I think is obviously a noble intellectual pursuit. But Fanon, I think, should be read here as understanding that police and state power were more than a kind of anti-state psychiatric context, right? It wasn't just the contextual move of anti-psychiatry that he was after, but the very conditions for how and why psychiatry does its work in this compound institutional form that we might call hospital plus penitentiary or hospital plus carceral. So in other words, the hysterics, and if we take the hysteric to the Algerian context, we might think of the homoerotics between the colonial doctor and the colonized patient, or moving into the more contemporary, the sexual violence at Abu Ghraib, right? It's not the patient, but state power. So I want to suggest that Fanon offers for us the hysteric or madness in its sort of performative form as the work of the state. but it's a hysterical madness that masquerades as the ultimate rationality. And here Fanon allows us entree into thinking about whether and how Foucault's insights are available for a kind of, that's a Freudian slip, right? It might even be hysterical, are available for intersectional analysis. So we know, for example, that in 1972, Foucault joined Sartre, who wrote the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, at a march against prison repression in France. We know that around the same time, Foucault was arrested for coming to the aid of an immigrant who was assaulted on the metro. We know, too, that in 1979, Jacques Donzelot, who was a Foucault student and mentee, and I want to come back to the family because I think I want to forestall this move away from the family by thinking in 73, by thinking about Donzelot's 79, Policing the Family, and about that being about immigrant families and the state and the carceral sort of working all together, and also about psychiatric power. So Policing the Family, based on his dissertation work, that would show how the French family comes to be intervened upon, especially immigrant families, by the state. And this is the same kind of mission creep that I think is taking place with psychiatry in the colonial setting that goes unacknowledged by Foucault as he does this kind of bifurcation of psychiatric power. So these issues, given Foucault's activist work, obviously did not escape him, and I'm not trying to suggest that they did. However, it's curious that they are not foregrounded as his theory of psychiatric power evolves. So I want to end by asking, why was brute power and its gendered, race, and imperial dimensions sacrificed at the altar of psychiatric power? And I'm not sure that I know the answer, so we can talk about that.
Okay, thank you, and I want to also thank Bernard for inviting me. It's an honor to be included. So I identified a couple of questions in my blog post, so I don't want to reiterate all of them, but I did just want to point at a couple of questions and perhaps elaborate on a couple of questions that are raised, not to answer any of them, but to offer them up for discussion. And there's 3 points that I want to discuss. First, the legitimizing power of medical expertise. Second, the conception of madness as a struggle over truth production. And third, the role of sexuality in the relationship between patient and psychiatrist. So to start with medical expertise, I thought that one of the most fascinating things for me in these lectures was the story of the psychiatrist's quest to establish his professional stronghold, both before the patient madman and before society more broadly. And through most of the narrative, particularly in the 19th century, he seems to do so by aspiring towards the status and role of the true doctor, by claiming the imprimatur of medical expertise. I think there's something very intuitive about the notion that expertise equals social legitimacy, specifically that medical expertise is somehow entitled to a unique professional status. I think it's a rhetoric that's very common in politics today. It's very common in academics as well. But as a generation of scholars who I think are very deeply indebted to Foucault have analyzed, it's also very oversimplified. There's nothing inevitable about the fact that discourses of expertise of any sort, including medical expertise, will command social respect or will win cultural legitimacy. Rather, the public's acceptance of certain pockets of expertise as a social authority of any sort depend on, I would say, at least 2 prior processes, perhaps more. But 2 of them are, one, the recognition or the establishment of a space for expertise through the recognition that lay knowledge is insufficient for whatever ends the public wants to pursue, and second, the public selection of a particular form of expertise among competing forms or competing paradigms. And both of these processes don't necessarily track developments within the scientific community itself, which the scientific community itself, of course, features various political battles over what type of epistemic paradigms are ascendant at the time, but the notion of lay authority or the lay acceptance of expert knowledge or expert authority don't necessarily track these processes, but reflect various other social, cultural, political, economic factors. So it seems to me that in portraying the psychiatrist's bid for authority in these lectures as an emulation of the unique or the privileged role of the physical doctor, the established doctor, obscures both the contingency and social factors through which expertise gains social legitimacy, also obscures the ways in which these factors might differ in the history of psychiatry's and physical medicine's claims to power. And I think Foucault's own work points to these different contingent factors. So in Birth of the Clinic, very briefly, I don't purport to discuss it here, but Foucault suggests that in a sense it's the consolidation of these post-revolutionary nation states that leads to a growing emphasis on medicine, as one answer to the nation's problems by protecting a healthy, productive citizenry. In psychiatric power itself, Foucault identifies two other social causes that buttress the psychiatrist's expansion of influence. So one is a capitalist explanation that ties into punitive society in a way, and there's a sense in which psychiatric power allies with capitalist bourgeois market pressures to free up adult labor by taking over guardianship of children who would otherwise sap the workforce. The second I find fascinating, but Foucault suggests that there's a very strategic moment through which psychiatrists increase their revenue and their relevance by portraying both abnormal children and madmen as dangerous, and therefore legitimate the use of public resources, public funds. It's a very monetary fiscal explanation. So it seems to me that these various cultural or socioeconomic explanations are interrelated. They're not exactly the same. So it seems to me that narrating the story of the psychiatrist's bid towards social prestige as a race towards the status of established medicine or medical expertise obscures how the path of physical medicine and psychiatry, or how physical medicine and psychiatry follow different paths toward establishing lay authority. And to the extent that we want to examine how psychiatry aspires towards and perhaps achieves a certain level of social influence, it's important to track not only how it aspires towards the status of established medicine, but also how its struggle for professional status departs from the path that medicine followed, not accidentally, not too necessarily to the detriment of the social standing of the psychiatric profession, but as part of an effective bid for professional legitimacy. It also seems to me that linking the psychiatrist's bid towards professional prestige to the cultural status of the medical doctor, this is a fairly thin analysis of the cultural factors that I just mentioned. So those that Foucault provides at least two economic or social analyses of the growing influence of psychiatry, but I personally found them to be somewhat literalist or rather thin. So we have two explanations. There's the hegemony of capitalism. We want to take children away, to leave their parents free to work. There's also the fiscal explanation. Psychiatrists who want more money portray their patients as dangerous. And I was curious about the interplay between these factors, particularly that notion, I'm sure we will discuss this in far more detail in several months' time, but the portrayal of abnormal patients as dangerous. How does that rhetoric of danger reach the public? How does it gain sway among the public? Does the public accept that claim based on the expertise of the psychiatrist, whose very expertise the claim of danger is meant to establish? Or does it reflect various other social factors and contingencies? Are there spikes in crime? And might it not, to recall our discussion 2 weeks ago of punitive society, tied to a bourgeois capitalist market regime that itself portrays developmentally abnormal individuals as delinquent or socially destructive? So it seems that here there might be an interesting link between these two lectures, but certainly a question of the social construction, the possibilities of expertise that I would have loved to see more about. So that's one question. My second question about the question of madness as production is much quicker. So it seems to me one of the more robust lectures or fascinating lectures to me was the January 9th lecture, where Foucault proposes the doctor's centrality to the functioning of the asylum depends not on the content of his superior knowledge or expertise over mental illnesses, but rather the tokens of knowledge through which he impresses the patient, through which he imposes his will upon the patient. And my question reading the lectures was how precisely these tokens of knowledge are meant to augment the doctor's authority in the eyes of the patient himself, not in the eyes of society or the lay public or the family of the patient who submits him to the ministries of the psychiatrist, but the patient himself. Foucault suggests that a core characteristic of madness is its insistence on its own reality, the patient's insistence on his sovereign ability to define his own truth against the protests of others. And if so, why would the doctor's tokens of knowledge, which effectively establish the doctor's fluency in a truth language that the patient or the madman has explicitly rejected, why would these tokens impress the patient? It seems simple enough to, and Foucault does suggest that these tokens of knowledge are effectively just tokens of knowledge. It might seem plausible to say that in this sense, it isn't clear why they must be tokens of knowledge specifically, or why they must be performed under the auspices of medical authority, why these are different than tokens of power, similar tokens of power and surveillance that could be demonstrated by a warden or a schoolmaster or an authoritative figure in any other type of disciplinary regime. And I want to propose for discussion or for rebuttal that perhaps there is a more specified role played by the doctor's claims to scientific or medical expertise in this context. And if, as Foucault suggests, the state of madness is in a sense a usurpation of control over the construction of authoritative knowledge, the madman declares himself sovereign over the facts of his own world, then might there not be something that's uniquely therapeutic, or uniquely pleasurable within the course of the patient's treatment, for the patient to submit to the psychiatrist's will, not simply as an imposition or display of stronger will, but as part of a production of authoritative knowledge. That is, whether or not the patient has any regard for the truth language in which the doctor displays his tokens of knowledge, might the patient have regard for the social fact of expertise and want to participate in that social reality. It seems this focus on truth production fits in some broader themes in this work about madness as a discourse over truth, particularly the notion of the hysteric insisting on challenging the doctor's authority by forcing the doctor to speak to her on the level of truth. But it's a very different relationship in this case between the patient and the psychiatrist. In the former case, the patient derives some pleasure from participating in the doctor's production of expertise or authoritative knowledge. In the latter case, the hysteric subverts or tries to undo the doctor's claim to knowledge. So it might be interesting to see to what we may attribute that switch. And the final point about the role of sexuality, my background is in the history of sexuality, so I was obviously very interested in how sexuality figures in this text. And it pops up in certain lectures. I found Alondra's point about the homoeroticism and Fanon fascinating because it does seem to pop up purely in relation to the patient, never the doctor. But it emerges most prominently in the final lecture, the February 6th lecture, and emerges as an ultimate challenge to the doctor's medical pretensions in at least two ways. First, sexuality is something that's preclusive of illness. For a patient's symptoms to include some kind of overtone of sexuality or rubricity is to show that the patient is not truly suffering from madness. The doctor is not a doctor. The second way is that sexuality appears to be the price the hysteric demands for participating in the psychiatric ecosystem with the doctor, the hysteric insists on affirming her power over the doctor by imposing a sexual narrative of life onto the apparently unwilling psychiatrist. I find the first claim very historically provocative. It seems to depend on the historical assertion that at least through the mid-late 19th century, either the medical profession or the broader public would have necessarily seen sexual antisocial behavior as reflecting desire rather than illness, and particularly a type of sane, lucid desire that is intrinsically preclusive of madness or disease. Chronologically, that seems a tiny bit off. There are studies pointing out that various doctors, including in France, pursued medical explanations or justifications for abnormal sexual behavior, at least in the late 1840s. But in a sense, this narrative accords with the broader historical trajectory that until the 19th century, sexuality is seen within the jurisdiction of the clergy as a matter of sin. Only the 19th century is colonized by doctors as a matter of scientific study. In the sense, defining sexuality against madness is very similar to defining sexuality as sin. Both accounts treat abnormal sexual behavior as something for which individuals must be held to account, something that cannot be thrown off to any other explanation. I think historically Foucault's assertion adds interesting wrinkle to this narrative. Typically when we speak of science or medicine colonizing sexuality in the 19th century, the suggestion is that in earlier years, science hadn't interested itself in matters of sexuality. Doctors were establishing their social legitimacy in other spheres, hadn't yet turned to the question of sexuality. But Foucault's narrative suggests that in earlier decades, medicine simply could not have gained access or claimed jurisdiction over sexuality, precisely due to the persistence of some broader social paradigm of sexual misconduct that affirmatively categorized such behavior as outside proper medicine. So for there to rise the science of sexuality in subsequent years, it wasn't enough for science to turn its sights to sex, to provide an expert discourse of sexuality, or even for the scientific profession itself to recognize the internal conditions of a scientific discussion of sexuality, but also required a more holistic chipping away at a broader cultural paradigm of sex as outside the sciences. And make that aside just to, with respect to Arnold Davidson's work clearly examines how in the 19th century there's a certain switch in epistemic understanding epistemic paradigms within the scientific profession that allows one to identify homosexuality as a mental illness, or not as a mental illness, as a disease. What interests me specifically, the paradigmatic switch among the lay public as a whole that allows the public to identify sexuality as a subject of medicine. And what's interesting to me about this formulation is that this hints at precisely the type of multifaceted social construction of the possibilities of expertise that I would have loved to see more throughout the lectures. But finally, my last point of interest about the role of sexuality more broadly in these lectures is the extent to which it seems that it may at least partly betray Foucault's later work by centralizing sexuality as a uniquely significant part of the self. For it seems to me that in terms of both of the functions that patient sexuality serves in the final lectures, either to say that sexuality is preclusive of madness because it is something for which the individual must be held to account, or to observe that hysterics consistently impose their will on doctors by subjecting them to explicit recitations of their sexual lives in particular, is to suggest, in effect, that sexuality is either something particularly central to the patient's self-definition, or at least something about which the patient uniquely desired to speak. And both of these claims seem to me to be the precise effects that Foucault would later suggest arise from the medicalization of sex, which psychiatric power foreshadows, the medicalization which the patient's sexual behavior makes possible. So I just wanted to end with a question about how Foucault's treatment of the patient's sexuality and psychiatric power interacts with that in history of sexuality, the extent to which they may be tautological or they may yet be reconcilable.
Marvelous. Thank you, Anna. So, being somewhat unsure as to how the full interventions would present themselves in the seminar, I had originally worked on some remarks to frame questions about kind of the role of the hysteric patient in reflecting the elements of disciplinary power. But I'm not going to. I'm not really going to develop that much, and instead turn to, I think, some of the provocative questions that were raised here. I mean, just in a word, what I would want to propose, and maybe later on I will, is that there is a relation. There seems to be a relationship between the maneuvers, and he uses this term a lot, the maneuvers of the psychiatrists, the passive behaviors of the male typical patient, the anonymous patient, really, and then the maneuvers, because he uses this term also for the hysterical patients, the female hysterical patients, and that the maneuvers, and sometimes he also says counter maneuvers, of the hysterical patients somehow respond to the maneuvers of the psychiatrists, seem to expose, for instance, kind of how the psychiatric questioning, which is one particular maneuver that's well detailed, and a maneuver he refers to as kind of the reuse of language, places the anonymous male patient in a kind of forced interplay of meaning, say, of which he doesn't seem to have much active role in, or of vowels, the Leray of vowels, these and the ones from 81, versus the disruption that the hysterical countermaneuvers offer, and how these reflect kind of central elements of disciplinary power, getting hold on people, implementing a process of continual control, imposing isotopic forms of classification, producing unclassifiable residues, etc. But one can look at these different maneuvers and see how they relate to these different elements of psychiatric power or disciplinary power. But I think that the more interesting thing, and I think where we should open it up, has to do with this challenge of what I heard as being essentially the depoliticized nature of these patients in the asylum, right? And eliding in some way the primary violence that might have been producing psychiatric symptoms, both in women and in the colonized subject. So eliding kind of the sexual assault, the violence, etc., that give rise to symptoms. And so I think that this question is very interesting particularly because of the contrast with the year before, where we have highly politicized subjects in the prison, in the penitentiary. Politicized, so it's the popular classes, it's workers who are being turned into criminals. And the whole effort there is to politicize the notion of the criminal, right? And politicize the notion of criminality and of this space. And the whole effort, not only theoretical but also practical at the time, was to break down the distinction between the common law prisoner and the political prisoner, so that every prisoner ended up being a political prisoner, right? A highly politicized subject. And so here we are, and the challenge is, I suppose, or the question is, how do we arrive at this, in some sense, depoliticized asylum patient, in a way? So I think that that's kind of the challenge maybe that we should address that might be fruitful and productive. And so maybe I thought I could open it up there instead. Nadia?
Yeah, perhaps at the end of the last book,
Yes.
There was already the gesture toward the less political, when he starts talking or interesting or writing about mores, habituation, at the end of when he says that in order to reach the body, we have to modify the soul. So the soul is a way of, that is the end of these lectures, and here is precisely what he's doing in some sense. It puts in actions in that plan that he was envisaging at the end of, in which practically there is not much to do. But I'd like to ask a question instead of going through, is the following. He proposed an interesting distinction between the wise and the doctor, the thinkers and the wise and the doctors, in relation to the mind, thus in relation to truth.
This is a contrast between the doctors and who?
And the wise.
And the wise.
And the wise. Wise,
Yeah.
the wise,
Yes.
the master, the sage, the philosopher, the teacher, we. So he says, page 131, however, you see that there is a difference between the teacher or demonstrator, the person who possesses the truth, and the psychiatrist, psychiatrist. Whereas the master of truth, the teacher or scientist, manipulates judgment, the doctor will manipulate reality in such a way that the error becomes truth. So it means that he becomes, the doctor is truly the magician who creates something that doesn't exist. It's like a kind of magicians in Goethe, it's the one that with this stick can create reality and plays with the world. And he used the expression miracle, 136, in talking about Charcot. The great miracle worker who makes things that don't exist in order to invent then his cure and does to. So the struggle is then between this invention and the simulation, because if you want to joke or to make a joke with a doctor in this case, you have really to go to the reality because he's creating a reality. So if you want to fight him on his method, on his terrain, you go back to the real, to what you are as a person, and you make him think that is creating the hysteric person, the reality on which he wants to work. I really think this is extremely interesting, because it is a way to to create the artificers, the god of this new technique of docility. Is because it is not simply curing something; it's inventing or creating a disease in order to curing it. So it's like a demiurgic actor, and does the creation of this total condition of domination. Domination mean or of subjection within this psychiatric medical science, which is not properly science. It's not properly, as it says, it's a kind of in between creation of reality and scientific analysis of this creation of reality. I find this extremely relevant, and also because it turns upside down the idea of truth and simulation, the idea of truth and reality. How can you deceive the doctor if the doctor itself is a deceptor of reality by creating something that doesn't exist? So this is, I don't know.
Rosalind, do you want to jump in?
I did want to jump in both with your last comment and with Nadia's, and in response actually to the very productive juxtaposition of Linda's and Alonzo's remarks. But I mean, I think at the end of our conversation last time, we were talking about the conflation of two concepts of civil war, and that we, Foucault was talking not about all against all, but about collectives against collectives, and there's something about the incapacity of disciplinary power, as opposed to sovereign repressive power, to generate collectives, politicizable collectives, that has something to do with this moment, the apparent evacuation of the more overt concept of the political, or oppositionality anyways, and we get the hysteric kind of standing in there where we're not quite sure what that is, but so this is, I think, enormously interesting, but just as you spoke, I was reminded of this fantastic passage on page 189. Psychiatric power, that is to say, the function of the intensification of reality, is found wherever it is necessary to make reality function as power. And we have, there's the statement that goes on there. Psychologists turn up in the school, the factory, in the prisons, in the army. It is because they entered precisely at the point when each of these institutions was obliged to make reality function as power. It goes on, and I mean, the entire conception of madness here is a kind of the intensification of what is. So that the therapeutic response also has to be a kind of intensification. Hashish bringing mania to a kind of level of maniacalness that exposes itself, and there's a kind of principle of imminent critique, I suppose, that's being enacted by the medical professionals. But it does leave us with the conundrum that is both articulated by both of you, but also in the space between the two of your interventions, that colonialism is surveillance disarticulated from disciplinarity. I mean, it's surveillance, but not disciplinarity. I mean, it remains in the register of the repressive, of brute, what you describing as brute power. And we would have to ask whether empire is empire. I mean, what is the four French empires? In Indochina, South Pacific, French Americas, French Africa. What concept of empire do we have left? I mean, it can't even be grasped as a kind of administrative logic. But I mean, I think what I learned from you is that the reason, or the a priori, that sees this surveillance implemented with such fetishistic rigor in the colonies, but not disciplinarity, is precisely what, Linda, you help us understand. Is because there's the freedom of the subject to be otherwise is not admitted in the colonies, or if it is, it's admitted as a historical antecedent that has already been essentially effectuated, but not as a possible future horizon. so that one gets in the colonies alterity, whereas one gets in the disciplinary society, one gets only the possible intensification of reality as both power and its own self-nullification in some. And this, of course, leaves the task of, you know, what forms of politics are available in that space. But I think that this was very helpful for me to hear this two together in that way.
Stathis, did you want to jump in?
First of all, I would say, Ross, that probably, I don't know what you would say about the civilizing mission, and that seems to me a disciplinary power.
A disciplinary power. Well, I mean, there wasn't much civilizing mission in most
No,
of
despite
French
its
Africa.
failure.
No. I mean, if you look at, like, for example, in Southeast Asia, where it's possible for colonized subjects to claim sufficient mastery of patrimony to make certain kinds of citizenship claims, that doesn't happen.
No, but despite its failure, its discourse, I mean, the civilizing mission, which is a French colonial discourse particularly, is in some ways. In any case, it seems to me that would be where we would look for disciplinary power and colonialism. I am struck by the notion of maneuver. That's very, very important to mention because it's a kind of technical term of interest, both performative and obviously strategic and military. But also the performative contradiction that that Linda mentioned in the position of the patient, who must on the one hand demonstrate truth, possess and demonstrate truth, but at the same time being deprived of the capacity to demonstrate truth. I'm particularly interested in the notion of truth and truth-telling, which is now coming into being at this stage in order to be developed, obviously, later. Obviously, all of these seminars are they are linked. It's very interesting that he calls this a parenthesis and so on. But I agree. There is almost a kind of direct continuity from the end of the previous one. There may be parentheses in his mind because he starts works and stops them, and he goes on into other interests and revises. But in effect, they are kind of part of a puzzle, and we're looking at them retrospectively, and we can actually see it. So truth-telling, and therefore the making of the subject, including obviously the making of the subject through and via sexuality, precisely in the way that I think every one of the presenters pointed out, and Alondra, you particularly showing this strange discrepancy between this and the later stages of the history of sexuality, where one might say, I don't know if it's anti-feminist, it's something we should discuss, but it's certainly androcentric, and male homosexuality becomes the mode by which that aspect is discussed. So truth-telling and the making of the subject seem to be really the core of what is negotiated by this factor that we can call power. There seems to be a kind of contention between these, let's say, two domains: the domain of expertise, knowledge, and so on, and the domain of subjection. I'm obviously generalizing on purpose here, just to see them structurally because of how they bleed both before and afterwards into his thinking. So one might say that there is an assumption to truth. I mean, I think that we would agree on the part of the notion of expertise. The experts don't possess truth. They assume to, they claim to, they perform as if they do. In that sense, not that differently from those who are clearly presumed to perform truth because they don't have it, the patients. And the difference, the thing that the arbiter, which is also the safeguard of this point of contention, is power, whatever hell it means. But I mean, it is this thing that he's trying to go after. Power is what determines, it seems to me, the space of contention between two different modes of truth-telling. And obviously one wins over the other in must, etc., etc. But at the same time, power is also, if one looks at it from that perspective, is also what enables him to unmask the presumption of truth on the part of the expertise or on the part of institution and so on. So this would be something that I would like us to sort of continue thinking about. And the last thing I would say is, and he's talked about this before, of course, from the beginning in Madness and Civilization, the madness that isn't subjected to the regime of truth-telling, meaning non-institutionalized, is the one that somehow escapes the vicissitudes of power. All of this stuff is in all kinds of quotation marks, of course, under the notion of genius or the notion of sort of the marginal, in the pre-modern era and so on and so forth. It is only when these forces are subjected to the regime of truth-telling under the arbiter of power that we have this kind of point of contention that he's investigating before and now. And so in that sense, psychiatric power or any sort of specific power could be used as the domain of examining raw power. I don't think that's a problem. It's just a cross section. There are so many of them, and he seems to be just engaging, in these specific domains in their limited mode in order to address this larger notion of what you call raw power. And of course, he's missing things all over the place, but that doesn't matter. This is how I would answer your question. Not an adequate answer, but
So I've got John, and I also have Antonio Pelle in Rio, who's got a question. But before I go to John, I did want to say, I think we should just mark pages 68 and 69 to come back to maybe in this conversation, because it does seem here as if, where he's specifically addressing kind of colonized people, that he does have a model. We're going to obviously be heading there a lot in the weeks to come. Yeah. But it does seem as if, he does say here, right, I think we can see all this as one of the first moments of the colonization of an entire society by means of disciplinary apparatuses. But then when he does talk about colonized people right after that, and it does seem as if he does have a model of, where did I see it before? It seemed like total surveillance. It seems as if the model here, at least in the colonial experience, is one, here on page 68, 69, is one of total surveillance, or a step. In other words, this lecture, 28 November 73, is a genealogy of elements of a genealogy of the disciplinary apparatus. And it seems as if the colonized situation forms a step in it somehow. He's not looking at it as we are discussing here, in terms of its.
But it's a step he turns away from
It's a step he turns
quickly.
away
It almost
Right.
makes him uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right. He just needs to move away from it so quickly.
Right, and of course it's the Jesuits in South America and not the Algerian experience, right?
I know this sounds scandalous, but I don't think he understands or knows this history well enough to actually critique it in some way. There are ways in which the issue of surveillance, of total surveillance, can't possibly be a possibility in a colonial context. It's not something that is literally physically possible. It doesn't mean that security can't be an absolute obsession. But there are issues. Well, we can go back to them later. But I'm concerned a little that we're taking it as if this is something that he knows about, in a way that there's so much evidence that Foucault rescinded from that space and moved from it. we know people are writing on Tunisia now and on Foucault, and that, but
Okay. But in any event, this would be a space which we should come back
Yeah.
to, I think, again, because of, but also because the way in which colonization then becomes, it becomes something about the colonization of the entire society by this, rather than colonization, and colonization as a historical step in a narrative or something, but not obviously
Evolutionary
a
step.
frontal. Yeah, right. John.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a few remarks about the historical context in which these lectures are being given. First, a good deal is known about this clinic, La Salpêtrière, and Charcot. There's an entire book called The Invention of Hysteria that reproduces the records. There's an enormous debate about it. We know a good deal about it. One of the facts about it is that Sigmund Freud was there. Sigmund Freud is the first person to bring the issue of sexuality out. In his obituary about Charcot, he says, you say it's about brain cells, but look at what's going on. It's all about sexuality. Can't you see that this incredible theater that you've produced here is really a theater about sexuality? In the period in which in which Foucault was writing.
Another Freudian slip.
I'm about to say why. Because I think Lacan is an absent person that he's addressing in these lectures. And why? Because, first of all, it's Lacan who first said that the hysterics are the persons who taught. Because Freud, you have to see Freud. This is part of an elaborate critical genealogy of psychoanalysis. I put that in his role in Foucault's work. So, before Freud went to Paris, there's no unconscious, there's no sexuality, there's nothing. It's because the hysterics taught. So, it's an invention, the invention of the category of hysteria. What Foucault is interested in is the role the hysterics had in inventing the idea of hysteria. It's more than a nosological category. It's a battle, he says. That's the context. So, in the period when this was going on, after 68, there was lots of political movements. One of them had to do with prisons. Another of them had to do with a feminist group called Psychanalyse Politique. This group, Psychanalyse Politique, reacted against Freud and Lacan's interpretation of Freud. Lacan responded to them, and you create a whole thing, the issue around which this battle took place, the question of truth. In 1969, Lacan's lectures are about that, truth, university, so and so. It's an enormous thing. Nobody here reads anything Lacan, I can tell. If you do, there's a very strong relationship to feminism. I don't think Jackie Rose or Judy Butler or any of these people can be understood without a relationship to what was going on. And that's the context. So what happened was these women, in pushing back against psychoanalysis, in causing Lacan himself to revise his own theory, that was the context of all this. And I think, to answer your question, Foucault saw something in this feminist struggle that was like revolts in prison. That's the thing that would have changed the thing. It just didn't work out, but either did the revolts in prison, for that matter. So it's very hard for me not to see these lectures as an elaborate relationship. Foucault wrote again about Lacan, the first person ever to reorganize psychoanalysis around the question of truth. We're talking about truth and the politics of truth, so it seems very central. So there's much more that can be said about this. If you want to read books, there's one by Hélène Cixous and Catherine Clément called La Jeune Née, I don't know what it is in English. It's a big story about hysteria. What? The Newborn, the big story about all the stuff about hysteria. Piquet-Pull founded a bookstore, Édition des Femmes. They work with prostitutes, they do all kinds of things. Incidentally, this problem of the interest, the fascination that these doctors had for the bodies of these hysterical women, for which is a parallel, obviously, in this Fanon case, is very much part of the discussion. There's a famous painting which you see these kinds of swooning women and these doctors looking like clerics, looking, it's an incredible fascination. So why are they so interested? Anyway, I just wanted to add this as a remark about the historical circumstances, and in the development of Foucault, I'd say, why is it that in those last lectures you don't hear about the hysterics at all anymore? He doesn't think that that's important anymore. Stanley, it's not true that Foucault never talked about sexuality before this. He wrote about Sade, he wrote about transgression, he wrote about bataille, and all of that is very much connected with psychoanalysis. Anyway, it's, for me, very interesting that nobody pays any attention to this, which I nevertheless think forms part of the larger context in which these debates are going on. Because, when we read all this stuff, it's useful to see a pattern of argument and development in Foucault himself, but he's responding to things that are going on at the same time, and it's useful to see what those things are. Just a remark.
So, thanks, John. Antonio from
Yeah,
Rio.
so exactly, we received this question
wrote
from
a great article
Yes.
that we posted on the blog. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we received this question from Antonio Pele from Brazil. So we encourage everyone to write to the email and ask every question possible from anywhere and everywhere, because we'll bring it to the table to start with. So just to situate this question a bit that Agnes will read to us, this question goes back, well, to this idea of the movement from the politicization to dispoliticization, the movement from the penal to the psychiatric.
And it also addresses questions of truth that have aroused here. And he brings a question to a quote with his question. So I'll read. I'll start with the quote. It's on page 269, and it's right after Foucault. It's when Foucault talks about the medical surplus power. But then he goes on and he says, so it's in the middle of 269, however, on the other side, there's a prodigious surplus power of the patient, since it is the patient in terms precisely of the way in which he undergoes and comes out from the psychiatric test, who will or will not establish the psychiatrist as doctor, who will either refer him back to his pure and simple disciplinary role, or allow him to play his doctor's role, and you understand through what opening. And Antonio Pele would like to pose, and it might be a specific question for Linda, or that's what I feel, but it's open. What would be the similarities and the differences between, on the one hand, the doctor-patient relation, so for instance, the surplus power of the patient, which will or will not establish the psychiatrist as doctor, as in the quote, and on the other hand, the role of the avowal in penal practices, so wrongdoing and truth-telling, if there's a link between those two practices. So I don't know if anyone
And to a certain extent, I think that really picks up also on your intervention, which is the question of so the way in which the hysterical patient is participating in her own subjectivation in light of.
No, I think what Foucault was saying is that, and it's complicated because there's also the anti-psychiatry movement. There's Cooper. Cooper, because he has a problem with Fanon. He has a problem with somebody named Juliet Mitchell, who was a feminist at the time, who was a girlfriend. So you have a movement, an anti-psychiatry movement in Britain and Europe. Basaglia, you have all those people. That's one thing. He doesn't like Goffman. You can't explain asylum, you can't explain this whole thing just by looking at the rules of a given institution. There's something more going on. There's a dispositif. But what is this dispositif? That's the question. So there's a kind of very complicated and interesting game, I think, where in making the hysterics the anti-psychiatric militants, he's eliding or doing something with this feminist movement. Because, the anti-psychiatry movement, I don't think you hear a lot about women or women's bodies. If I in this area, that's what it's about. Even if Charcot didn't want to see it, and Freud did, and so on and so on. So I think there's this kind of complicated game in which he's locating the anti-psychiatric movement, the principle of the anti-psychiatric movement, and therefore the way retrospectively he, Foucault, who's a genealogist who's now looking at this, will analyze the thing called power, and how those two things are related. Because it's the same pattern. You have revolts, you have movements, you have and so on. So that poses a new problem for Foucault then as a genealogy. He's looking back and trying to explain how this thing arose called power, which these people are disputing in the two forms. So I think the reason it's very difficult to reconstruct all of this if you're not corrupted by this enormous literature is that what Lacan said about hysteria, you see it very much. Because what happened to Freud afterwards? He went to Vienna. Well, I'm sorry, I'm saying too much. No. He had a lot of hysterical women patients, Viennese women patients, not like these working women that were in La Sapatrie. And what happened with these Jewish women in Vienna? They were suffering from reminiscence. But there's that struggle over the category of hysteria, over Freud's right to know about their unconscious, their desires continue. And there's a famous case called the Dora case. In the Dora case, it's of course written up by Freud, but in the end of the case, Dora says, "You haven't understood anything," and so it's kind of incredible break. That case was written up by Hélène Cixous, the person who was in the Psyché Paul movement, who had created écriture féminine, how do you write outside of patriarchy, and blah, blah, blah. So she did something called the Portrait de Dora, the play, in which at the end she says, if the women's movements had existed, Dora would have been a feminist. I'm just saying it gives you an idea of this battle. So I think there's two things. Foucault, in making the hysterics, because it's a kind of funny claim or it's a strange claim that's striking even now. These women were that were having trouble understanding, basically. But I think it's part of Foucault's humor. He's saying the anti-psychiatric movement, it really starts in this problem that's been so important for these French feminists, for this Psyché Paul movement, for the search for something about women's bodies that's outside psychiatric knowledge, that psychiatric knowledge is trying to contain, which is why with this simulate, because hysterics, they're very funny, they're forcing Charcot all the time to produce a medical knowledge and this crazy knowledge of the brain that didn't exist at all with respect to it, didn't have to do anything to do with that. So they're pushing him. That's why there's a game. That's why there's this kind of strained struggle with and the doctors replied, as with the maneuvers, oh, well, you're just, if you're not doing what we say you're doing, then you're inventing it. And so it's that battle and that maneuver that forms part of this larger debate. Yeah.
So there's some interesting time travel, right? So we're going from Charcot to the 70s, like that's so fascinating in the way, because it's precisely what Foucault's doing this genealogy writing in the 70s. So what, to go to Roz's point, this issue that she raised on 168 about the intensification of the real, part of what the anti-psychiatry movement is responding to, and I think this partly answers the surplus power of the patient movement, is that there is no surplus power of the patient when the intensification of the real becomes psychosurgery, as he mentions towards the end, becomes MRIs, and a kind of abstraction, a technical and scientific abstraction, that the hysteric, the excess, performativity of the hysteric doesn't even matter in that context, because what we are interested in lies in the brain, or lies sort of in this other register of truth.
Yeah.
That's
in your book,
no. But that sort of captures or abducts the excess.
Yeah, I think another aspect of this is that in this clinic, there's Freud, therefore I'll describe him a little bit. There's another doctor named Pierre Genet, who's a French doctor. what happened in France after this is that the French establishment, they didn't like Freud. They liked Janet. So there was this incredible nationalist rejection of psychoanalysis in favor of Janet. But what's interesting, if you look at those two figures, Janet and Freud now, is that, and here we're talking maybe not of the 70s, but the 90s, they invented the category of trauma. What do hysterics suffer from? Traumas, traumatic early memories that that's what Freud will say later. I'm just inventing it. And so they have bodily symptoms that they somatize what they can't say because they've had this violent thing that's happened to them that they don't know how to deal with. That comes out later in the symptoms and so on and so on. So Janet and so what we mean by trauma, there's a trauma industry now. There's a big thing. The question of trauma, violence, and so on. It hasn't gone away at all. And so, if you look at Cathy Carut, to mention another feminist, she goes back to see how that trauma was invented. How the two doctors took different points of view, and so on and so on. So, I don't know. It's. I agree with you. It's a now we're in a situation where things look very different. I don't think there is an anti-psychiatry movement of the kind that existed there, for better or for worse. Where psychiatry is dominated by neurology. Neurology is dominated by drug companies, if you like. You're going to do kind of Foucault analysis of the whole thing. It's a very different formation now. So, anyway, sorry.
So, Linda, you wanted to jump in, and then we've got a few more comments, so go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, I think what you're saying is important in the sense that it probably is true that Foucault is, gesturing in the direction of these feminists and their critique of hysteria and Freud's treatment of it and all of that. But what I think is interesting, just to come back to the question that I think was, in a way, implicit in everything that we were saying, and that then Bernard brought up, formulated as a question, which is, why does he then sort of shy away from the political, so the political reading? And, I started my comments with, what does Foucault want from the hysteric? What is the function of the hysteric for Foucault? And, like all good undergraduate papers, if I had rewritten this paper now, I probably would have started with a slightly different argument, which is, I would still probably stick with what I was saying. But I think what's interesting, if we turn to page 138, because this page really, for me, is very significant in trying to understand why the hysteric, not hysteria, but hysterical, simulation, right, is so important for him. And yet at the same time, I think why he then ends up kind of pulling away from giving the kind of reading that he actually has to give in order to produce the sort of history that he wants to produce. So I hope people, can I read a little bit?
Yeah,
so I'm just in that second.
This is on 12th December. It's just at the end of 12 December.
It's the last full, it's that last really big paragraph, so it's the third paragraph from the bottom. So I'm going to start with, this is why I don't think we can make hysteria, people with me? The question of hysteria, the way in which psychiatrists got bogged down in hysteria in the 19th century, a kind of minor scientific error, a sort of epistemological blockage.
Key passage.
Right? I'm going to then start skipping. But anyways, it is clearly very reassuring to do this because it makes it possible to write the history of psychiatry, the birth of psychoanalysis, in the same style as the explanation of Copernicus, Kepler, or Einstein. Right? And then he goes on and, we find secure footing in this scientific knowledge, and starting from this kind of dead end, see an epistemological break, and then the sudden appearance of Copernicus or Einstein. By posing the question in these terms and by making the history of hysteria the analgon of these kinds of episodes, the history of psychoanalysis can be placed in the calm tradition of the history of the sciences, which he is clearly just trying to break apart with all of his work, as you well know. However, if, as I would like to do, we make simulation, and so not hysteria, the militant underside of psychiatric power, rather than an epistemological problem of a dead end, if we accept that simulation was the insidious way for the mad to pose the question of truth forcibly on a psychiatric power that only wanted to impose reality on them, then I think that we could write a history of psychiatry that would no longer revolve around psychiatry and its knowledge, but which would finally revolve around the mad. And he goes on. But the interesting thing here to me about this is that So the hysteric is important, or hysterical simulation is important for him in terms of just breaking apart this whole history of the sciences and how it is done. He just wants to do it differently. So it's not only like anti-institutional in the way that Bernard said in the beginning, it's also anti-epistemological, right, which is part of that.
Yeah, knowledge is very central.
Exactly.
So is power. But
And that
knowledge-
means, then you tell this other story where these people who are just the objects of knowledge suddenly become like subjects in some way. I mean, he's actually pointing to that. Like, that would be their story. Like, you would somehow bring them forward in a way so that they would be challenging the very constitution of these institutions, et cetera, that are defining them as mad. So that would point outward towards the political reading. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, in a way, it's like
Yeah, but that's
well, no, let me just finish. So
Yeah.
it's pointing out towards the political reading in the sense that he wants to get precisely those people who are, not included in the. It's almost like the great man. It's like they're absent they're absent from the great man history. They're absent from the history of institutions history and all this sort of stuff. But in a weird way, I feel like he is still trapped within a kind of confined logic of these epistemological tellings, if you know what I mean. Like, he hasn't quite broken out of that. He sees what's wrong with it, and so he wants to bring in the mad. We'll tell their story, and then that instead of this other story. But he actually ends up replicating in some way, only at a different level, exactly what he's accusing the epistemological or institutional sort of accounts of doing. So that's my comment.
So I've got Dana, Poland, and Noah, and Adam on the deck. Go for it.
Okay, I'll try and be brief, although I always say that when professors say I'll be brief, they're not. But I wanted to pick up, you really helped me by using this phrase, Foucault shies away, and that's what I wanted to talk about a bit, and I wanted to connect, use the word Foucault feels, or at one point you said something like Foucault feels uncomfortable, and it's this kind of shying away from politics but wanting to engage with it that really struck me reading this text. And one of the things that struck me was how punctual the politics of hysteria is. So, there's the passage you just read, there's the let us salute the hysteric passage, but they come as these fleeting moments and very punctual in the writing of a text that for overall seems very much, to my mind, much more about the success of power than the resistance to it. So that resistance becomes this very subterranean thing. And power, every time power falters, it uses its very faltering to actually reinforce itself. So we get this great moment. Psychiatric power doesn't know the differential, but then railway accidents happen, so that allows it to discover the differentiality. So each setback to power becomes a new resilience of power. And in that respect, the later Foucault, or what's going to become the later Foucault, is almost undone in advance. And what you were saying, these moments of genius or the burst of the exceptional that come up in the later text, I think are in a way anticipated negatively in this text. So I guess in your opening when you said that there's not a theory of governmentality, I'd nuance it slightly. I think there is, but it's there to be taken away. And you were mentioning page 68, 69. On 66, he actually has a moment that sounds exactly like the later Foucault. He talks about in the monasteries, the ascetic training of the self.
Yeah, but that's what I'm
Right,
saying.
but he does it to say it's not at all
Right.
resistant. It actually is another place in which colonization occurs. I have the French. He says, this ascetic work on the individual was a form of colonization. It's the pedagogy. So it's not the later Foucault, but it's using the language of the later Foucault
Right.
in a very different way. And I think then what happens is, we get everything is colonized, including the virtuality of madness. I found that fascinating through this book, that it's not merely the reality, but the virtual, that we can anticipate, we can go inside the soul, we can know what's going to happen before it even happens, and that can be controlled. So power is insinuating itself at every moment. And what that means is I think things like the hysteric can only be these kind of punctual moments that show up, and then Foucault shies away from them, or it's almost as if he can't continue with them. So he has to salute the hysteric, but with no real reason to do so at that moment, and the lecture ends. And it's, in a way, and then maybe someone else was saying this, you used the word replicate. There's a way in which at times I felt that Foucault, especially as we get towards the end of the text, and it's Charcot can't talk about sexuality, it's almost as if Foucault replicates that by starting to bring it up as he knows the lectures are ending. So I'm going to talk about something that I can't talk about, and then it's over. I don't know if that made sense, but I found this the bleakest of texts, and the moments of resistance seemed almost, to use a word that someone else was using, they seem magical, like they're brought in,
Right.
and then they can't be followed through.
So before we go to Noah for a second, I think it's interesting to see, right, though, that the pieces of resistance are tied to the way in which we participate in our own subjectivation in here, in these lectures. And these moments are interesting. I mean, direction of conscience is an interesting moment here that you were just pointing to around page 66, 67. And the avowal is an interesting moment. Now, and these are things that are going to become important, right, around 81, 80. And I think we need to remember that part of the effort at dissecting psychiatric power / disciplinary power here is to get at the way in which we ourselves are participating in it, because without that you can't imagine resistance, I suppose, right? And so even though the resistance is a moment that you characterize as kind of, depressing in the text, I take it, though, it's that those glimmers, those movements towards the maneuvers that we operate on ourselves are really important to any possible conception of future resistance. It's kind of the double valence of it, I take it, right? Yeah. Did you want to jump in on that, or okay? Noah, Ben Asher?
Yeah. So my comment it relates directly to what you just said, Linda, but also I think to what Nadia said before, and what Anna you talked about in terms of why are we listening to experts? Why is what's going on with expertise? So when we were talking about the difference between truth and reality, and then your comment, I was thinking about Nietzsche's Madman, which always blew my mind. I was wondering in what sense is he responding as much, maybe not to psychoanalysis as he is maybe to his mentor Nietzsche, who writes in The Gay Science. I'll just remind you where it starts. It's one of the most dramatic passages in The Gay Science where, have you heard of the madman who writes or runs around with a lantern and saying, "Where's God? Where's God? We've killed God." And here are the churches as they're the signs of his existence. And that's the madman, right? And then this is the madman. I always thought of Diogenes as that madman. And this is the cynics that he will then be thinking of in the 80s, right? So maybe that madman idea here is just a way of him to start thinking about what have we lost? We've killed God. What does that even mean, right? What does it mean to have killed God in our times, right? In our 70s, through the sciences, through all the expertise, right? So I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about, what is the madman doing here in his work, if at all?
Let me get Adam in first, and then maybe you want to intervene. Go ahead, Adam.
So one point about another context for interpretation. It may simply be very obvious, but the name hasn't been said out loud yet. It would seem to me that the ongoing struggle with Derrida and Derrida's devastating critique of the history of madness hangs over this entire text, and when he's attempting to disrupt the epistemology, it's not just the history of science, but it's Derrida that is really the target of
But in the first lecture as well, he's saying that he talks about moving from the discursive and what might be.
So then the other question was really about this issue of of politics and depoliticisation, and or the oddly unpolitical quality of the latter half of the text. And I couldn't help wondering whether that sense had something to do with the selective way in which the commentators chose to approach the text, which was largely to bracket the lectures of the 21st and the 28th of November, which Anne and I were chatting about it before the conversation started, which are surely an answer, and again you may contradict me, but surely an answer to another possible interlocutor, which is Althusser, and contemporary Marxism, and an odd, in interpolation or an insertion of an argument in relation to them in dialogue with French Marxism in this period, and that then I think heads back to what Dana was saying, which I take then the rest of the text to be a kind of depressed commentary on the kind of iron cage-like quality of the argument established in the 21st and the 28th of November, and then the move to the hysteric as this sort of appallingly marginal site where a kind of resistance can still articulate itself. So that's where we end up. But if we are going to talk about the political quality of the text, then it seems to me that we do have to go back to those two early lectures, which do such a powerful work of framing and linking this particular argument to the first three series of lectures that we've already read.
Yeah, and when you but I think that you can link those early lessons from November directly to all of the work that's done on these maneuvers that comes much later, right? So that's in January. I mean, so in other words, if you have to read all of that effort at understanding the microphysics of it's his turn, right? The microphysics of how you ask questions of the patient, right? And you interrupt the patient, and you correct the patient in the most minute little ways, et cetera, which then would lead to a more political reading of that bulk there of the lectures, which means that I don't think that we necessarily pass, as you suggested, into kind of like a depressed state of kind of.
This is taking it in danger.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to conclude, this is the agenda set in the final sentences of the first lecture. The entire lecture series is an experiment, really, in substituting this pseudo-military vocabulary for the psychosociological vocabulary, which is the target,
right.
Which is an alternative mode of escaping Derrida. An alternative mode of providing a kind of institutional material foundation for this answer, and one would be the psychological, sociological, and what he's attempting here is this pseudo-military.
Okay, so I've got Nini, and then I've got John, and I've got Rosalind. I'm sorry, Nini.
I would just like to stay with this question of politics, just a little bit, if we could. And also bring it back to Noah's earlier question about what is a madman doing here. So I have this question that comes from a very significant, for me, lesson on November 14th, 1973, which was the beginning of the Polytechnica uprising in Athens. It was. It was the first day of the uprising. I'm sure that he didn't know anything about this. But at some point he says here, now that I said it, it's actually on December 5th. It's a question of rights. Right? So he brings up the question of rights. Right. When he says on page 95 that he's talking about the madman, right, and not the hysteric, and he says I'm reading in the the paragraph before last. He says he's talking about the 1838 law, right? He says that it talks about family and interdiction. He says that in taking charge of the mad, the essential component is now confinement, interdiction only being added afterwards if necessary, as a possible judicial supplement when there is danger of the individual's legal situation, his civil rights being jeopardized, or alternatively, when the individual may jeopardize his family situation by exercising his rights. Right. So here is, I think, an absolutely political question that is happening. Right. I mean, the rights of the individual, of the mad individual, versus the rights of the family. Even as the rights of this individual could be trampled upon through interdiction and hospitalization, right? So I want to go back to this question: what is the madman doing here, right? What is and my question is it possible that Foucault actually is looking at the madman on two different levels? One is the level of the simulation, and the other one is an ontological level, where he tries to collapse the two, right? And think about simulation as something which we would later call performance, and right, and the ontology of the madman, who nevertheless does not get stripped of his rights, right? I mean, that, I think, is that a question? Is that a question? Is that a question? Is that part of your?
Yes. Great. John, and then Rosalind, and then I've got a question from the LST room.
Well, of course, I see this in maybe a different way than others. I think in the first part of this lecture series, Foucault is saying, I wrote something before called L'Histoire de la Folie. Now translated as History of Madness is I now realize that I need to rethink this. Why do I need to rethink this? I need to put in these categories of power that I've discovered already in the case of prisons. But now, with respect to what I did before, what is it? And as you point out, the key idea in all of this is this idea of dispositif. A dispositif is not an institution. It's a way of linking together knowledge and power and so on and so on. And that's a good deal of that first part of the thing is about how I have to change my mind about this earlier work. And, you know, the passage you were reading, hysteria, he's saying it's not just a nosological category. It's not just a psychiatrist's idea. It's a battle. And that's why it's much more significant. If you say now there are no hysterics, it's no longer in our psychiatric manuals, it doesn't make any difference, because what's significant about this is this other thing that I'm trying to tell you about. So as far as History of Madness itself, it's that book that Derrida wrote a criticism of. You agree? So Foucault, in that book, and in the passages that Derrida finds objectionable, Foucault had a certain scheme. What was wrong with the confinement of everybody in an asylum, the great confinement, and then this reform movement from Pinel that happens after her? How does all of that work? We've confined madness itself. Madness no longer has an outside. The madness is no longer the case of Nietzsche, of course, is very interesting, because Nietzsche himself, as you know, went mad. The last 11 years of Nietzsche's life, he sat in the house and banged on the piano, and everybody said he was mad. And his sister took the manuscripts and turned it into something Nazi. So the madness of Nietzsche was part of this group of people, including Artaud and Goya and all these people, who had carried on a dialogue between reason and non-reason and so on in this earlier phase. So what was bad about psychiatry is that it closed off this dialogue between madness and madmen and all the rest of it, and then given us a monologue of Musin, I forget all the passages, a silencing. Derrida doesn't like the passages in the Meditations of Descartes where he says, where Descartes is trying to get the indubitable truth. He says, maybe I'm mad, maybe I'm not. So it's as though in those meditations, Descartes was silencing or excluding this thing. So that's sort of the context. So I think in this book, and pinpointing the solution to this problem, not in the way Derrida does, which is we have to reread Heidegger and go back to the history of metaphysics and all this. He wanted to have a political and a historical rethinking of his own work, which was focused on current political movement, which came primarily from feminists. That's a little bit the way I see the situation.
And shutting the specific tool that Derrida exploits, right?
Right.
The issue of representation.
Right. Right.
That's
and on the point of the dispositif, that was Jesus's.
Oh,
we're
really?
going to have missed dearly,
Oh.
And I hope he's feeling better. But we'll get that post up on dispositifs. Rosalind?
Yeah, I mean, I want to continue along the same line, John. I mean, I agree in many ways with what you're saying. I mean, if there's a Derridian text that is the analog of this, it's Ga. It's, do fetishism to the hilt. I mean, not that that's the referent or that it's even possible for it to be to the referent, but that would be the set of conversations I think that would make sense to read alongside this text, because there are lots of other names you could drop in here. There's a Kojevian kind of reading of the dependency of the surplus power of the doctor on the surplus power of the patient and so forth. But when we get to that last February 6th lecture, and we do get the narrative of trauma as the hysteric as having to force her life story and her sexual desire into the space of trauma. Yeah, I mean it's quite remarkably articulated. Yeah, into the breach opened by this injunction. Sorry, I'm on 318. However, what will the patients do with this injunction to find the trauma that persists in the symptom? Into the breach opened by this injunction, they will push their life, their real everyday life, that is to say, their sexual life. And we get that long description of the confrontation between Charcot and his patient, and it's not incidental that he terminates that in the moment when, Camille, kiss me, give me your cock. I mean, this is the moment of displacement of feminism into a kind of gay male politics of desire. That desire, we will do that to the hill. And
yeah, I mean, the things that Foucault wrote about Charcot were not confined, as you know, to this. They recur in La Volonté de Savoir, which is what
the Wilton,
the history of whatever
Volume 1.
Volume 1. So if you look at the passages there, because I think by the time Foucault writes La Volonté de Savoir, he no longer thinks he has to struggle in the same way that he was in this with this whole Lacanian thing. He thinks he's going beyond it, essentially. That's what this repressive hypothesis is about. And the passages on Charcot, it's all about incitement to desire. This theater, this performance, because it's incredibly theatrical. I mean, you can make a performance piece out of it. There's films made out of it. The surrealists loved it. So I'm not inventing it. This incredible theater, it's not repression. It's an incitement. And the way he collected all those dossiers, and he did it, and he filmed them, and he drew them, and all of this is this incredible way in which this game formed part of thinking, power, knowledge, and seeing, and incitement, and so on and so on. So the trauma side of it, I think, is interesting because there's the category of trauma itself is so important to us. Maybe in a way that was less important when Foucault was writing this. And part of it, there's been a big criticism of Freud himself, that society says Jeffrey Masson and so forth that attacked Freud. But it's very much forcing this into this idea of trauma. But I would say that in his account of what was going on in La Salpêtrière, these working class women in this particular, there's one called Antoinette, I think is the main one, knew how to play with that, knew how to force the doctor. You say I have a symptom? Ah, well, tell me what the knowledge is of the symptom. Ha 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 ha. You say it's this. My body's going into another form, which shows it's not that at all. If you see what I mean, there's this kind of, that's the maneuvers part of this operation. Anyway, it's a little bit.
Okay. And we had another comment from our live streamers.
So the live streaming in Twitter room has LSP room as a question that it feels like it's a bit of a provocative question, but it's linked to the context to it that Foucault is also addressing through his lecture beyond. So it's adding to the feminist dialogue that he could have had, but it also touches upon possible reasons for the depressive state of politics in this in this series of lectures that's been detected.
So it's
And
definitely, it's definitely a more direct and blunt question. It says as follows: isn't it obvious that Foucault was demoralized by the decline of political contestation in the mid-70s? Aren't contemporary French politics the source of the transition from 1972-73 to 1973-74?
What do you, Nadia? Did you want?
Yeah. Until 81, 82 is a carnival of contestation.
It was against knowledge.
Yeah,
it was against the university.
What are the
He's coming also to the point of a certain kind of, for lack of a better word, the politics of sexuality, of queer liberation, of the avowal of a previously sexual desire is the site at which.
Well, in the Dora case, that's what it's about. It's the Dora's relationship to Frau K. It's the crux of it. I mean, that's it's what Freud didn't see, because it's a case of.
I know, I'm not talking about Freud.
Anyway,
You're talking about Foucault.
I'm saying there's a kind of place at the site of politics in response to the recognition of this particular reality structure, and that, for better and worse, as you just said, it entails a certain kind of appropriation and disavowal of a feminist project as well, I think.
Yeah, it was a complicated.
That this is the price tag.
I've got Stefanos Geroulanos.
So I would completely agree with this point that it's not obvious that this is demoralization. It's clear though there is a very distinct rhetorical organization going on, which is a perfection of a language that has begun in the late 60s and is not yet complete. Does not have the clarity that it will have in Discipline and Punish, but it certainly does have a kind of passion and force that it does not have in the previous years. At the same time, instead of being demoralized or hesitating, he hesitates about a lot of things all over the place. He's not necessarily hesitating or shying away. On the contrary, you can see him being very definitive. There is nothing except for the hysteric that's going to make it. The old system of power and sovereignty is gone. It's been inverted into the madman who's still attempting to speak as a sovereign, and that was the George III theme that you brought up in the beginning. I think you're absolutely right about the point on simulation, that is exactly the form that he's going to see. And it is the most embodied form, because precisely the point of it is that it does not speak. The symptom doesn't speak. It's made to speak. And then it's to be brought back. So in that regard, I don't quite see, I'm entirely with Adam on the point that there is no sense in which this text is a politically hopeful text. It is the text that's trying to articulate a system of language, and at the same time the embodiment of that language and the empowerment of that language into the behaviors of psychiatrists and those in science. The whole argument on intensity. And to complete this, just to cite that one duet that is not being cited, and that makes a clear point that this is not about Freud or Dora or anybody of that scenario, and that's Guattari and Deleuze. The book has come out Anti-Oedipus came out a year before. Foucault has written an extraordinarily aggressive preface in its favor. But here, there is nothing about anti-psychiatry that is that is in support of anti-psychiatry. There are 2-3 citations. I hesitate, he says, to bring that back, to call an anti-psychiatry. It's only in the summary that this is going to come up. So by comparison to that, you can see here a similar kind of superstructure or perfection of a structure as Deleuze and Guattari brought up in Anti-Oedipe, taking place at the point of a psychiatric system and encounter, but not one which allows for any, ultimately, you can say that on one hand the gesture is political in the radically anti-institutionalizing sense, but then there isn't anything other than the sense that this rhetorical overload is an expression of at once the horror of it and the structuring of all of this into a language to manage an encounter. That was, I suppose, my objection and my sort of direction in this last little while.
Okay, so I have, I think I have three more comments, and then maybe we can let our guests conclude and give final thoughts before we close. I have Nadia first.
Yeah, just very few comments. One has to do with the movement of anti-psychiatric movement all around Europe, and that was an important moment of they abolished, they closed by law, they closed asylum and they closed the psychiatric hospitals, and so that was an important revolutionary outcome through the law and through the institution or the institutionalization. Second, I think sooner or later we should go indeed to discuss a little bit about the dispositif, which is nothing to, it's very juridically terminology that he takes from the Roman law and has to do with the ability of creating something mechanically. It's like a formula or like a ritual that is able to create things. Marriage doesn't exist, but only through this formulaic that makes it. That is an important a mechanical way of creating things.
Yeah, no, the word.
Okay, I know the pliance and the mechanic, but it's a long l'appareil. It's l'appareil, but it's
also Christian anyway.
It's Christian and it's in the Roman law. But we don't have time now. But it would be very important.
Okay. Yes.
So I lots about this.
I just wanted to pick up on the notion of Guattari and his over against the anti-institutional reading here, Guattari's experimentations with the institutional structure of La Board. And it certainly was in the area they were looking at or something like that, so it wasn't any secret perhaps at the time what Guattari was trying to do, and it really was a big success until the deep in 72. So it would have been certainly there, so I just wanted to reinforce that point.
Okay, great. Dana?
Two quick things. I want to pick up on your argument about it's hard to find a hopeful here. And one, just a quick point to agree, and then a question for everybody. I guess what fascinates me in the moments where Foucault acts as if, despite everything he said, there could still be something hopeful, and this is what I was calling those punctual moments. So, the passage you read earlier at the end of the December 12th lecture, we don't want this calm history, we want a different kind of history. He ends that paragraph by saying, we should write a history of psychiatry which will no longer gravitate around psychiatry and its knowledge, but would gravitate finally around the mad. Right. And that does not seem at all what he's done everywhere else in this book. So much is about psychiatry and its power. So it just seems, it's again this link, these glimmers of hope that he gives no ground for. And I think the flip side of that is, I like your phrase, rhetorical overload. And I just want to ask us a question. I'm fascinated by the role of the scene in Foucault. The opening of Discipline and Punishment. Here constantly, and he talks about psychiatry loves scenes and loves to have these anecdotes. But then he himself loves the anecdotes where power is so effective. And I just, if people have, constantly comes up. Bathtub showers. The role of the scenic fascinated me.
Start this with
this is perfect way to come back to what I was trying to say before. The fact about the encounter, where power is an arbiter and a safeguard, and that is, of course, all these kind of theatrical performative situation, which is crucial to Foucault in his staging throughout his thinking. I don't think the question here is not whether things are hopeful or they're opposites, or whether the resistance or hesitation is a mark of resistance in the psychoanalytic sense, which is the opposite from the political sense of resistance. In order to determine whether this text is political or not political, the text is totally political, even when it is expressing a hesitation, or even doubt, or even a disappointment, and what have you. It is political because it is trying to engage the microphysics of power. It's trying to bring into the surface a particular mode in which power can be understood as an arbiter and a safeguard. This is the political here. The political is not in a kind of it's not always the revolutionary upturning. It is actually, the political is really the staging of contention. This is where we can understand how power works, because contention is always marked. It's never symmetrical and so on.
Great. Okay, so I think that maybe what we'll do now is come back to Linda with our guests, starting with Anna, and then go ahead.
Sure. So I guess just as some final thoughts, I've been really fascinated by this discussion of the politicization of the subject, or the extent to which this narrative ties into broader power structures. And I guess it seems to me that the absence of a stronger political discourse isn't a question of despondency or inability or failure of imagination under interrogation. I actually completely agree with Anne. It seems like a very deliberate retreat. And it seems to me that there are a number of moments throughout the work where Foucault does hint towards, very explicitly towards, a broader power structure, including state structure. And I think we've discussed the colonization, which I thought was a really fascinating moment. But I think another passage in the book that it's difficult for me to think about politicization in these lectures that pointing to is on page 249, which is when Foucault talks about the interaction between the psychiatrist and the legal system. And it's this very, very vibrant paragraph that I wish had been several paragraphs, where he says that one of the reasons the epistemic notion of crisis had to be rejected in the asylum is because the doctors themselves, without any invitations from the courts, without invitations from the prosecutors, without invitations of the attorneys, came to court and insisted on linking crime to madness. And I think this is just fascinating for many reasons. One, it seems to very explicitly acknowledge that Foucault understands that this asylum system is functioning on the peripheries of juridical power and state power and punishment. Although it seems to me it's such an explicit recognition that it must be a deliberate choice not to address it. Second, I think what's fascinating about it is that in most cases it seems like Foucault's disciplinary regimes all coexist together and feed upon each other. And in this case, you see the disciplinary regime of the asylum establishing itself as an alternative to the disciplinary regime of the legal system. Just fascinating. The third point is one wonders how the doctors end up in court if no one is inviting them, and one question is whether it's the defendants themselves who are inviting them. And the question there is, if we're talking about the agency or the power or the resistance of the patient or of the madman, to what extent is part of that agency or part of the power resistance choosing to invoke the discourse of madness and that type of institutionalization to avoid the rhetoric of criminality and penal institutionalization. And I guess the fourth point arises out of that. It seems that possibility suggests to me that when we analyze the power relations between patient and doctor, we must analyze them against the shadow of the alternate power relationships that would exist between prisoner and warden or prisoner and the state. So I think just wanted to highlight that paragraph.
And that paragraph gets really well developed in the final lecture, May 20th, 81, of Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, where monomania and the role of the doctors in creating that and the relationship to crime and the legal system are developed really nicely. Alondra.
I don't have any real, kind of substantive closing points. I guess I would just offer that
My gesture here was not just there's a lot of things that are missing here, and the gesture wasn't just to add something that was missing, because there's lots of things that could be added, but to think really seriously, I think, about all of Foucault's genealogical work and the particular kind of stories, the kind of historical stories that he tries to tell, about early modern Europe in the context of when he's writing in the 70s and 80s, and what the implications of that might be. And I think that, sort of thinking through that, even thinking about 70s French feminism in Cixous helps us to sort of see, I think, elisions, and helps us to sort of think about the contemporary uses of his work in ways that are, I think, fruitful for a new generation of conversations around Foucault.
Thank you. Linda?
Yeah, I don't know if I have. I guess I do come back to this page that I quoted from before, because on 138, in that the puzzle for me is if that's what he saw himself as setting out to do. In other words, he saw himself as setting out not only to question, of course you're right, his earlier account in the Madness book, not only to question his earlier work as such, right, but actually to question this way of doing the history of the sciences and all of that, then what goes wrong? In other words, that he's clearly understands that what one would need to do is switch things around and, tell the story from the point of view, if you like, of the mad, right? That's it's an entirely different perspective from which you would generate a very different history of these institutions. That's brilliant. Of course, that's great. And so then the question for me is, why doesn't he pull that off? I don't have, an answer to that, but I think, it makes me then want to know, for example, is it something in his account of power, even the account of disciplinary power, which he's now, much more clearly articulated in this text? Or what is it? What's sort of preventing him actually from doing the very thing that he sees this whole book as trying to do? That's just an interesting question. Well, for me at least, it's an interesting question. And then the other point, I suppose, is this issue of, it goes in a sense to what John was saying about, this, that he's pointing out, or he's gesturing out towards these feminist critiques, in that by figuring the hysteric as the figure of resistance, it's kind of curiously getting exactly backward what the whole point of looking out to the feminist critiques is getting right, which is to say that hysteria gets questioned not by this poor woman locked up in this asylum, okay, but it ends up getting questioned by the feminists outside the asylum, who may themselves at one time been locked up in these asylums, but in any case are just saying hysteria is, this is like a narrative that we tell about femininity in this society. And so they create a way of actually intervening, but it's not the hysteric. So once again, you would have to, even if you told the story, write the history of the mad, from the perspective of the mad, that too cannot be too insular, right? You have to be always pointing out towards the people who are organizing and doing things to make visible or credible what these mad women are saying or what they might represent. It wouldn't just be like telling their story from their perspective, if you see what I mean. So you still have to be going out.
Great. So then let's close on this one sentence on page 202. It's about 12 lines down on page 202. End of the first paragraph there, and he says, "It seems to me that, in the end, the diffusion of psychiatric power takes place by way of this development of the concept of the normal." And so, on November 16th, we will be back talking about abnormal. Thank you so much, Linda Alonso.